I had the report in your hands. We just mentioned that people know and recognize the need to do this, but also companies are not ready. What does that mean? Companies are not ready.
Well, hi, good morning, David, Annabelle. Thanks for having me here. As you said, we just released our global study of CIO for the new fiscal year. And some of the insights are really fascinating and insightful, right? Say, for example, in a nutshell, I think, the CIO are inside the tornado now. Because there's a lot of promises that AI is talking about how can they benefit the business. But the CIO report is clearly showing that there's a lot of obstacles that the organization needs to overcome, and this is beyond technology. Maybe double-click a couple of insights, right? So, say, for example, most of CIOs sees the speed of implementation, and also the lack of a copyright policy with regard to AI are some of the big challenges, right? So the key thing is, technology is one important pillar, but there are broader things that we need to consider in order to, deploy AI in an organization and, see the results.
So lack of adoption or widespread adoption, lack of policies as well, some of the key issues. Does that sort of signal there's perhaps an education gap as well?
Well, our view is there are a few things, right? So indeed, there are 4 things that we need to consider. Number one is for whoever, regardless of individual or corporation, when they deploy AI solution, security is the number one issue. Number one thing that we need to consider. Second is people, because in our view, AI is not going to replace human being. It's going to augment human beings. So there's another thing that we need to consider is how can we upskills and train the organization in order to help them to unleash the full power of AI. And the last but not least is about the processes, right? Because with the deployment of AI, there's a lot of processes that need to be renewed in order to, unleash the full power of AI. So there are 4 pillars from security, people, processes, and of course technology that we need to consider.
Right. One of the things that also stood out to me, you mentioned it already briefly, is the challenge of justifying the investment. Right? The ROI on doing this, it's very difficult because it's new in 2-3 years down the road. How much of that is a problem, right? And should we look at this as an investment too, or a necessary expense? Because then you don't look for a future cash flow. Well, for the latter.
Yeah, that's a great question. So if we look at the study of our CIO, this is one of the top 5 problems that we hear from our CIOs. That's why I think in Lenovo, our approach is to look at a broader perspective, not just technology, right? To see how can we help our customer to discover, the readiness of AI. Which part of the organization is more ready for deploying AI? And then how can we calculate the return on investment? Because at the end of the day, right, our CIO and CXO need to build a business case and justify the investment. Now, if you look at Asia, right, because we're sitting in Hong Kong, we see different kind of insight from different part of Asia. For example, we see the CIO from India. They already seen a better return on AI investment. Now, for example, in Singapore, right, there's a unanimous, almost 100% of the CIO that we survey is going to double down in terms of AI investment. Now, the last example I'm gonna share is, for example, in China, the CIO in China are seeing more return of deploying AI solution with regard to achieving their overall sustainability goal, right? So obviously, in terms of return on investment, there's something that we need to and we have to do with our customer to realize to come up with the ROI, and there are different requirements and different maturity in different part, at least in different part of Asia, right, that we can help.
What's interesting as well from the survey, you found that 96%, so nearly 100% of CIOs are committed to spending more on AI over the coming years, but only 20% expect their overall IT budgets to grow by more than 10%. So what misses out here?
Yeah, square that circle for us.
Well, I think the number one thing insight is that, would there be some shift, right, from left to the right or right to the left? Right, but indeed, if we look at AI, this is across across department, across industry. right? So in our perspective, AI is going to benefit, all use cases. Now, that said, I think in our experience, even when we deploy internally AI solution for Lenovo, right, which is a huge organization, a complex operation, there are a few use cases that are more ready and proven than the others. For example, service desk support. Right, service desk support for a bank, service support for my organization. This is more ready. On average, we see at least 15 to 20% efficiency gain on a help desk with the AI deployment. The other thing that we see a more mature use case is about software development, right? On average, again, about 15 to 20% of efficiency gain in software development, right? So how good is that? Even my organization, because I also run the IT for the company, and this is where we can learn the experience, the tool that we develop, not just for Lenovo, but it's proven for Lenovo as well as our customer, and that's why we can help.
People tend to be averse to things they don't fully understand, and I'm wondering, anecdotally, I had the conversation a few weeks back with somebody, and we were talking about this topic, and one of the things they brought up was, well, our internal policies are not as updated to embrace the new technology, and I'm wondering how much of the education that Annabelle brought up, and the need for corporates to look at their internal policies and be open to this new technology. How much of that is a challenge right now?
Well, it's based on our CIO study and our interaction with our customer. This is one of the big thing that our customer is facing, and hence Lenovo can come and help. Right? For example, everyone is talking about AI. As I said, security is the number one thing to consider. Second is, how can we deploy AI responsibly? Right? Is there any bias and hallucination that we need to take care, right? So that we can deploy AI for a company responsibly. Now, as I said, the thing that I want to emphasize, this is beyond a technology discussion, right? This is a broader discussion among security, data, process, and technology. And that's why I think starting from last year, we have established a new AI practice, which is including advisory and also implementation and managed part of the AI solution, so that we can help our customer to approach the AI solution deployment holistically, and at the end of the day, realize the full power of AI for companies and our customers.
One last follow very quickly, if you could. You mentioned data security is a big issue. Are companies tending to find AI solutions with companies that are aligning geopolitically, for example? Chinese companies looking at Chinese solutions, American companies looking at American solutions, as an example.
Well, I think one of the things that we learned, because we also have global operation, we operate in 180 markets. The number one requirement from our customer is how can they comply to the law and regulation of the different jurisdictions across the world.
Right.
And this is something that Lenovo has a lot of experience and also technology that can help our customers.